The Vatican has decided to end all Latin Masses in the Diocese of Knoxville. This comes as a surprise to people who were maybe expecting a different approach for this pontificate. So we're going to cover that situation, especially in the context of other liturgical events that we've seen recently take place in the church. And we're going to ask what kind of message and signal this sends in light of them. So all of that is coming up next here on the Michael Lofton Show. So news officially broke that the dicastery responsible for the sacraments and worship in the Catholic Church, this particular dicastery has instructed the Diocese of Knoxville to end all Latin Masses by the end of November of this year. And so we're going to see what the bishop is saying, what the diocese is saying is going to be provided instead. And again, we're going to consider this also in light of some other things that we've been seeing taking place liturgically in the church. And again, we're going to ask the question, what kind of signal does this send to have kind of a crackdown on Latin Masses, but maybe not on some other things that are going on liturgically in the church, especially things that took place recently in Rome at St. Peter's Basilica. If you've been following this channel, you know exactly what I'm referring to. So, but if you don't, we're going to be touching on it here today. So I want to go through all of the sources, go through the evidence, show you what the diocese is saying, and then consider the wider implication. And then after that, I want to touch on just a few other stories that are going on right now in the church, as well as a follow-up to the situation where the man sacrilegiously urinated on the altar of St. Peter's Basilica recently. There was that assault that took place on the altar, one that has happened, the second one this year, but also on the heels of another one that took place in 2023. Horrible situation. There is an update to it, however, so I want to cover that as well. But before we dive into the story at hand, I do want to just make y'all aware of something time sensitive here. So if you go to rtcourses.com, my website where I offer all of my courses on the magisterium, right now you're going to be able to get a really good discount on them. If you check out, again, rtcourses.com, you'll see the lecture that I'm delivering in 1 week on October 25th. It is Understanding Papal Infallibility, its nature, history, and challenges. If you go and purchase that course right now, after you've purchased it, you will then get access to a 30% off code for the entire magisterium bundle. And this is the same one that I offer for my students at a Catholic university, and attempting to show people how to understand the magisterium, how to read magisterial documents, stuff like that. So if you don't really know how the teaching authority of the church works and you want to get a comprehensive overview of the question, you'll want to go ahead and take advantage of this discount on the bundle, because it's 30 lectures for 3 courses that I offer at the university level as a professor. You get 30% off if you go ahead and purchase and reserve your spot for the October 25th lecture that I'm delivering on papal infallibility, what it is, what its history is, and challenges to the question that we've seen historically on papal infallibility, and some responses to the challenges as well. So take advantage of that now, because you have that until October 25th. And by the way, if you can't attend that session live, that's fine. Once you purchase the lecture, you'll always have access to it. And same for the magisterium course. You know, it's at your own pace. So you don't have to follow a schedule or anything like that, but take advantage of it now while you have that opportunity. 30% off the already discounted price. So you can't beat that. Okay, let's talk about the situation with the Diocese of Knoxville. Let me share my screen and show you what's going on. So this is an article by the Catholic Herald, posted 2 days ago. Exclusive: Knoxville Diocese indicates Vatican order for end of all diocesan Latin masses. So it's the Vatican that's ordering this. And again, I think that's going to come as a surprise to a lot of people who are hoping that The crackdown on the Latin Mass and the restrictions on the Latin Mass was just a phenomenon of Pope Francis, and that would be kind of reversed or at least dialed back heavily by his successor, Pope Leo XIV. I think people are starting to see signs that's probably not going to happen, and that Traditionis Custodes and the restrictions on the Latin Mass will continue. And just in case you're not familiar with the background, long story short, Traditionis Custodes was a document released by Pope Francis, kind of reversing Pope Benedict's opening up of the Latin Mass and more access to it. At the time, right after the Second Vatican Council, there was a restriction on access to the Latin Mass under Paul VI and also under John Paul II. Although they allowed for some exceptional cases for it to be celebrated, it was pretty inaccessible. In Summorum Pontificum under Benedict XVI, that was opened up widely. But Pope Francis argued that a lot of the reasons for the opening up of accessibility to the Latin Mass were undermined by dissent on part of Latin Mass communities, he argued. So he said it was defeating the whole purpose of opening up access to it. Therefore, we're going to restrict it. And in order to have access to it, you have to get permission from Rome, so Rome can make sure there's no dissent going on. And also, in order to bring the Roman Rite into one form, instead of having an extraordinary and ordinary form, under Francis, Rome wanted to have more just one form, so kind of put the situation with the Latin Mass as, okay, we're going to offer this in rare cases for some people, but just by way of a concession and only for a temporary period of time, and we're eventually going to phase it out. And again, a lot of people thought that document Traditionis Custodes that restricted the Latin Mass under Francis, a lot of people thought that maybe Pope Leo was going to undo that and open it back up, kind of like Benedict did. That doesn't appear to be the case. There continues to be more and more restrictions on the Latin Mass coming from Rome in this pontificate. And so I think that's I think that kind of answers the question for people who wondered what Pope Leo was going to do about this. Okay, so Bishop Mark Beckman of Knoxville, Tennessee, has directed that all celebrations of the traditional Latin Mass in the diocese cease by the 23rd of November, 2025, in accordance with the Vatican's implementation of Pope Francis's 2021 motu proprio Traditionis Custodes. So this is in accordance with that restriction that Pope Francis made in 2021. And Rome has not given permission for a continuation in this diocese of those Latin Masses. In fact, it's instructing the bishop to go ahead and end them. The move, confirmed to the Catholic Herald by Diocesan Communications Director John Mecklenburg, follows instructions from the Dicastery for Divine Worship and the Discipline of the Sacraments to bring Knoxville into conformity with the Holy See's guidance. Okay, so there it is. They've confirmed that this isn't just an initiative of the local bishop, but rather this is something that is a directive from the Vatican telling the local bishop he needs to go ahead and continue with Traditionis Custodes and implementing that in his diocese. So there's confirmation that this isn't necessarily originating from the bishop, although the bishop is in line with it, but it's something that's being instructed from Rome, from the Vatican. By the way, those of y'all just now tuning in, hey, make sure to hit that subscribe button if you appreciate this commentary and the comments and videos that you find here on this channel, especially if you've benefited from this channel in the past. Go ahead and hit that sub button. Okay, communities affected include Holy Ghost Church in Knoxville, St. Henry Parish in Johnson City, and the Basilica of Saints Peter and Paul in Chattanooga, where the 1962 Missal has been celebrated regularly since 2014. No alternative venues for the pre-Vatican II Rite have yet been designated. In a letter circulated among parishioners at St. Mary's Church, Johnson City, on the 7th of October, parish clergy announced a gradual transition from the extraordinary form, commonly called the Latin Mass, to the ordinary form, commonly called the Novus Ordo, of the Roman Rite. The reason why that terminology is used is, you remember Benedict in Summorum Pontificum said that the Latin Mass and Novus Ordo, they're not two different rites. He said they're two forms of the same Roman Rite. Now, there's a lot of people in the Latin Mass community that don't agree with that, but that is the position that Benedict maintained officially in Summorum Pontificum, hence that language, extraordinary form and ordinary form, rather than pre-Vatican II Rite, post-Vatican II Rite. The letter outlined that traditional elements such as ad orientem, that's where the priest is facing east in the celebration of the Mass, rather than facing the congregation. Gregorian chant, use of the communion rail and Latin would continue with the 2002 Missal. That's going to be your Novus Ordo Missal, reflecting what diocesan officials describe as the faithful's desire for these rites. Okay, so they are going to allow in its stead, in its place, instead of the Latin Mass in the 1962 Roman Missal, instead is going to be the 2002 Roman Missal, which is just an updated version to the 1969 Roman Missal. And it's going to allow for the Novus Ordo to be done facing east, which people would argue that actually, according to the rubrics, is how the Novus Ordo is supposed to be celebrated. So facing east with the use of Gregorian chant, the use of Latin, and the use of communion rails. So it'll be, one of those high forms of the Novus Ordo. Some people have attempted to call this like a unicorn Mass, where you see the Novus Ordo celebrated in a way that kind of resembles the Latin Mass, and they'll say it's a unicorn Mass, and it doesn't really happen. Maybe that's going to change, under this implementation of Traditionis Custodes. Maybe as a concession, there's going to be these things, and very technically, it shouldn't be a concession, because again, very technically, one could argue the unicorn Novus Ordo Mass is actually how the Novus Ordo is supposed to be celebrated. But that's all discussion for another day. So Father David Carter, rector of the Basilica of St. Peter and Paul, addressed the change in an October homily entitled Treasures New and Old, which we'll take a look at here in a moment. He said the decision marked a path of unity, affirming that the move to modern Missal, the modern Missal, would preserve the treasures of our tradition while remaining in full communion with the Church. Mr. Mecklenburg told the Catholic Herald in full that Bishop Mark Beckman has been working closely with 3 pastors in the Diocese of Knoxville, where the traditional Latin Mass has been celebrated. No issues were identified in the celebrations. This decision directly follows the Dicastery for Divine Worship's request that Bishop Beckman implement Traditionis Custodes in the Diocese of Knoxville. So again, that's going to be a letdown for people who thought that maybe Pope Leo would dial back Traditionis Custodes and would open up more accessibility to the Latin Mass. He added that the bishop had assured the faithful that legitimate aspirations for transcendence, reverence, and beauty will continue to be honored, but within the celebration of the 2002 Missal in Latin, and that pastoral support will respect parishioners' wishes while honoring the Church's current liturgical practice. This description brings to a close nearly 2 decades of diocesan support for the traditional Latin Mass, which expanded under Pope Benedict XVI's Summorum Pontificum in 2007. Across the United States, similar restrictions have followed Vatican instructions to ensure that diocesan worship aligns with the post-conciliar liturgical reforms. Okay, so we're going to look a little bit more at this story, but I do want to maybe go ahead and throw it out there and maybe, again, kind of put things into perspective and just kind of ask. I totally understand what Rome is attempting to do here and the bishop is attempting to do here. Setting that to the side, the question is going to kind of be, what signal is being sent here, just contextually, right? Because as I covered, in great detail, I was one of the few covering it at the time and expressing concerns when this happened. But we just recently had, an LGBTQ Mass take place in Rome. Pope Leo sent a bishop to celebrate the LGBTQ Mass, so it's not that he wasn't aware of it. He personally endorsed it and sent a bishop to celebrate it for them. And this Mass included a rainbow cross during the Mass. And then they took that rainbow cross and officially processed it into St. Peter's Basilica with the Pope's permission. And they brought in pride flags, pride shirts, transgender flags, gay men holding gay men's hands, walking in there as a homosexual couple with the blessing of the Pope and allowed by the security guards. And it was just a sight to behold, to see this kind of thing take place. Here it is. There's a rainbow cross, being processed into St. Peter's Basilica. Very concerning, very troubling. Of course, Pope Leo has never come out and denounced this because, again, it had his backing. So when we see stuff like that, and whenever we see what I've been calling out for a long time now, actual pride masses being celebrated by bishops and priests, and nothing is done about it. We even see celebration of, many bishops in Rome, not Rome, but Italy, celebrating liturgies with women. We're seeing bishops elsewhere at really important basilicas celebrating Mass with women, women priests who are of the Lutheran and Anglican background. When we see that and there's no consequences, there's no discipline, there's no motu proprio against pride masses. That's never happened. No pope has come out and issued an encyclical, an apostolic exhortation, a motu proprio, or whatever document, not even a general audience, not even a homily. No pope has come out and said, pride masses are wrong. This stuff is wrong. There's never been any restrictions on this. We've never seen anything like that come out of Rome. But what we do see are restrictions on the Latin Mass. And so the question is, setting aside whether or not there are legitimate grounds to restrict accessibility to the Latin Mass in some cases, setting aside that debate, because that is a debate that needs to take place in and of itself. The optics is kind of what we need to consider here. Let's just assume, for argument's sake, there's good reasons to restrict access to the Latin Mass. We've discussed some of those options, and we've had that conversation many times on this channel, and kind of talked about both sides. But just assuming there's a good reason for that, when that's taking place in a context where there are no restrictions taking place on pride masses that promote homosexuality, it sends the wrong signal. It's bad optics at the very least. And it's going to be very scandalous. And it's going to lead a lot of people away from the church. It's going to cause them to feel like, okay, I can't do this. I'm going to Eastern Orthodoxy, or I'm leaving Christianity altogether. I've seen people of all kinds of perspectives, in the comment section say they're going here, they're going there, they're leaving Christianity altogether, they're going to Orthodoxy, they're going to Protestantism. I've seen all sorts of stuff. I've seen a lot of people say, I was going to convert to Catholicism, I'm not going to do it now because of all this that is going on. You have to step back from like the liturgy debates and the question of the accessibility or inaccessibility to the Latin Mass. Just take a step back from that debate and argument and ask, is that really what Rome needs to be focused on, restricting the Latin Mass, and not maybe some of these pride masses and pride masses and gay masses and stuff like that we got going on there? Shouldn't those maybe be given priority? Kind of take care of that thing first, then we can have a conversation about Latin masses. I think that's a fair question to ask, right? What are Rome's priorities here? And what are the optics here? And what is the impression people are going to walk away with? And is this going to help people by restricting access to the Latin Mass in this context? Is this going to help people draw closer to the church? Or is this just going to drive them further away in light of the context? Look, I think we know the answer to that. I think we know this is going to end up backfiring and not draw people closer to the heart of the church. It's rather going to make them feel like outcasts and hurt by the church, and it's going to drive them away. And so you have to really take a step back and say, setting aside the liturgy wars and debates and discussions about what form and all that, what are the priorities right now? And also, what are the optics of this? And is this going to do more harm than good? And again, I think we know the answer to that question. So let's continue to maybe look at the situation, though, now that I offered that bit of commentary. There's a few other documents to maybe look at in association with this. This was released by the diocese, brothers and sisters, in collaboration with Bishop Mark Beckman and the other pastors of parishes in our diocese, where the extraordinary form of the Roman Rite is currently celebrated. Masses in the extraordinary form will begin to transition to the ordinary form. This transmission brings our diocese into conformity with what has been requested by Pope Francis in his motu proprio Traditionis Custodes. The final Mass in the extraordinary form to be offered at our parish will be on the 28th of November 2025. Until that date, the extraordinary form will continue to be offered every Sunday, with 3 exceptions. In order for us to celebrate the solemnity of Christ the King as one parish family, the ordinary form will be offered on October 26th, November 23rd, December 14th. Will also be offered in the ordinary form. Monday Mass at 6 will continue to be offered in the extraordinary form. As part of this transition, Mass will begin to be celebrated using the Missale Romanum, the 3rd edition of the Roman Missal. Despite this change, Mass will continue to include traditional elements that do not conflict with the Missal. Therefore, Mass will continue to be offered ad orientem. The altar arrangement will remain the same. We will continue to make use of the communion rail. Gregorian chant will retain its proper place in the liturgy. The Mass will continue to be offered in Latin, and there will be incense along with other traditional elements. So it's kind of by way of concession, finding a balance. I know that this transition will be difficult for some. As your pastor, please know that you are each in my prayers, and as we undergo this change. It's my hope that we can embrace this transition with both faith and charity. We must remain united to Christ, for he is the vine and we are the branches. Without him, no matter our motives or feelings, we will not bear much fruit. For apart from him, we can do nothing. The Eucharist we receive is the same Lord who comes to us no matter which form of the liturgy is celebrated. Next Sunday, October 19th, I've scheduled time after 2 p.m. for anyone who would like to join me for a discussion. Okay. So, he's kind of doing his best to be there pastorally for his congregation in light of the transition. But, I am already seeing people saying, hey, I'm leaving, or, I'm going to go to the SSPX, or I'm going to Eastern Orthodoxy, or what have you. So, it still remains to be seen on the whole what the reaction is going to be. But already there's a lot of comments that show this isn't being received very well. Here's a commenter saying, another diocese canceling the Latin Mass. Our priest announced today at the Latin Mass that the Diocese of Knoxville, Tennessee is transitioning away from the Latin Mass, impacting Johnson City, Holy Ghost in Knoxville and Chattanooga. No alternate location was mentioned. My wife and I feel gut-kicked because we just moved here, in part due to a TLM nearby. The letter below was handed out after Mass with hundreds of long faces leaving today. Please pray for the Diocese of Knoxville. So again, there's a lot of people who are hurt by this, right? And so again, there's a debate on whether or not the Roman Rite needs to be one form or two, whether or not the extraordinary form is something that is going to be more helpful, or is it going to be more of an obstacle to people today? There's a huge debate and discussion on all of that. And again, setting it to the side for the moment, aside from the issue of, again, what we discussed earlier with the Pride Masses in that context, how are people going to process this? Are they going to process this in a way that is faith affirming, or are they going to process this in a way that, kind of like we just saw here, one feels that they received a gut kick, right? I think, again, a lot of people are going to be hurt by it. And so you have to really ask, how pastoral was this? Um, how sensitive was this to people's needs? Could this have been implemented in a better and more effective way? Should this have been implemented right now when there's huge issues going on liturgically in the church in the Novus Ordo, especially with Pride Masses? It seems like I'm not seeing a whole lot of sensitivity to those things, and I'm just kind of seeing a blunt application of Traditionis Custodes. And you again have to ask the question, is that going to end up doing more harm than good? Continuing with this, however, there was that homily that we just saw referenced there earlier. Let me maybe read it to you. You can't really see it on the screen, so I'll just read it. So the homily that we saw there referenced treasures new and old, talks a little bit about this homily by Very Reverend Carter, pastor and rector of the Basilica of St. Peter's and Paul, on the 12th of October. He says, as you're aware, in 2021, Pope Francis issued the motu proprio Traditionis Custodes, limiting the celebration of the 62 Missal, commonly called the traditional Latin Mass, and replacing the broader permissions granted under Summorum Pontificum by Pope Benedict XVI in 2007. The decision was a heavy cross for our community. And not only that, but it's just so much back and forth, right? Rome's gone from, you got the Latin Mass, severely restricted, open it up a little bit, continue with more restrictions, however, then opening it up significantly, and then restrict it again. I mean, it's just, I think that Rome could have handled this from day one more effectively, at the very least. Since Christmas 2014, we have enjoyed the celebration of the Mass according to the 62 Missal, at least monthly. In 2020, discerning the legitimate desires of the faithful and following the still valid processions of Summorum Pontificum, we began offering the 62 Missal every Sunday at 11:30. Thus, when Traditionis Custodes was issued 1 year later, our pastoral plan was disrupted. At that time, I am reminded our parish that St. Peter's Paul is a Novus Ordo parish at which the traditional Latin Mass is celebrated, and the primary purpose of doing so was mutual enrichment, one of the goals Pope Benedict XVI identified in Summorum Pontificum. Pope Francis said that, that mutual enrichment desire was sabotaged, and it ended up being backfired, and it wasn't fruitful, and there wasn't a mutual enrichment, and that was one of the reasons why he chose to kind of reverse the reversal. I also strongly urge that we receive the Holy Father's directives in humility and obedience, resisting any temptation to oppose proper ecclesiastical authority. We must make a choice to be Catholic or Protestant. Many mistakenly cling to the trappings of Catholic identity rather than its essence, which is union with the successor of Peter. As for Saints Peter and Paul, we choose to be Catholic. I totally understand that. I get that point. But I think that what can't be overlooked here is, there's something to be said about the question of dissent and Protestantism and being Catholic and obedience to the magisterium. Look, I've talked about that at length for years, right? That's kind of my expertise, if you will. But you have to consider that in conjunction with being pastoral, right? As a father, I can certainly kind of have a heavy hand and say, to my kids, no, you have to do this. I'm your father. You have to listen to me. I can pull that card, and I have every right to do that as a father. I have that authority. But if I know it's going to be done in a way that they're just not going to receive it well, even if they're wrong for not receiving it well, right? Even if they're in the wrong, I'm aware of that, and I know that if I know there's a more effective way for me to do it, I should probably take that, right? So that's kind of the same idea. Yeah, Rome has this authority, no doubt. That's very clear from the Council of Trent and Vatican I, as I've pointed out. In fact, there's an anathema for anybody who disagrees. I've pointed this out, and been criticized a lot for it, but it is what the magisterium says. There's an anathema for people who say Rome doesn't have this kind of authority. But Just because you have the authority doesn't necessarily mean that you have to implement it with a heavy hand. There's still that question of prudence. There's still that question of being pastoral in your application of it. And I think there's something to be said of the timing and whether or not this is an effective application. But he continues, after a year of discernment and consultation with pastors where the Usus Antiquitor is celebrated, Bishop Mark Beckman has received a request from the Dicastery for Divine Worship in Rome to implement Traditionis Custodes in the Diocese of Knoxville. Like the centurion in the gospel who famously said, Lord, I'm not worthy, but also said, I'm a man under authority, so too Bishop Beckman is a man under authority. He loves the faithful who are devoted to the ancient liturgy and bears no ill will towards you. But he and I with him have professed an oath of fidelity to the Roman pontiff. See, a lot of people aren't aware of that. I've talked about this a lot. And not only that, an oath of fidelity, but also the profession of faith, right? It is for us also to make this our refrain. Lord, I'm not worthy. I too am a man under authority, he says in Latin. We are not the masters of the liturgy. We are its servants. The truth is that since 2021, we've been living on borrowed time. Another pastoral reality we face is that the lack of clergy trained to celebrate the 62 Missal. I'm the only priest in the Basilica able to do so. What would happen if I were unavailable due to illness or travel? Moreover, our split between two calendars, liturgical calendars, has created an unintended division, two sets of readings, two feasts, two rhythms of time. It is increasingly clear that the Spirit is calling us to unity. After consulting with Bishop Beckman, we've reached a clear path forward. The Diocese of Knoxville will be transitioning all celebrations of the Latin Mass from using the 62 Missal to the 2002 Missal in Latin by the end of the year. In this way, we are not losing the Latin Mass nor the Roman Rite. The bishop has assured us that the legitimate aspirations for transcendence, reverence, and beauty will continue to be honored. The celebration of the 2002 Missal in Latin, with all the traditional options and elements already permitted in its rubrics, will ensure that the treasures of our tradition are preserved while remaining in full communion with the Church. This is not the path of loss, it's the path of unity, he says. He says, I know this decision is difficult for many who have grown deeply attached to the more ancient form, yet I urge you to respond with humility and obedience. No one is being deprived of the sacraments. The Eucharist is no less Jesus in the 2002 Missal than in the 62 Missal. The Holy Father rightly cautions those who perhaps unintentionally suggest otherwise. To remain Catholic is to remain united with the successor St. Peter. The Church's movement is towards a unity of faith expressed in one Roman Missal while still drawing deeply from the same well of tradition. Our worship will continue to be beautiful, reverent, and sacred. The spirit of Summorum Pontificum, the mutual enrichment between old and new, has borne fruit. You are the proof of that. Now we're called to carry that fruit forward into the life of the Church as it stands unified today. Skipping ahead a little bit. I speak to you now with the heart of a father who desires only your good and your salvation. Don't be Protestant. Remain united with the Church that Christ founded. In our time, some voices, though clothed in reverence and tradition, are drawing faithful souls into attitudes of suspicion, division, and disobedience. He says this is a grave danger. It is never a light thing to separate oneself, even in spirit, from the body of Christ. To elevate personal liturgical preference over communion with the Church made manifest, especially in the office of St. Peter, is to risk repeating the tragic errors of the past, errors that began with zeal for reform but ended in rebellion and schism. Some communities, such as the Society of St. Pius X, may preserve venerable liturgical forms, but they do so outside the full obedience owed to the Vicar of Christ. The Church has made clear that their canonical status remains irregular, and the faithful are not encouraged to attend their liturgies. Participation in such communities, when it expresses a rejection of the Church's legitimate authority, can constitute a true rupture of communion, a wound to the unity Christ desires. The Church's own canonical experts have clarified that a person formally adhering to a schismatic communion or movement may incur the penalty of excommunication. This is not about punishment, but about seriousness of choosing separation of communion. The Pontifical Council for Legislative Texts explains that such adherence occurs when one opts for the followers of Lefebvre in such a way that this option is placed above obedience to the Pope. As I've often repeated, it is good to be right, but you have to also be right in the right way. Hold fast to the faith, but do so within the bark of Peter. This is not the moment to abandon ship, but to trust the captain who calms the storm, even if you have fears and anxieties in your heart from the waves. We're not losing the Mass. We're gaining unity. We're being invited to carry the treasures of our tradition into the heart of the living church. The same Jesus who is truly present on the altar has not changed. His grace is not diminished because his church has reformed her rites. There's a little bit more, but I think you get the gist of it. I've spoken about pretty much everything that was said there at great length here on this channel, documenting much of this thoroughly, canonically in the magisterium, numerous statements of popes and bishops. So, if you're a regular viewer of the channel, there's nothing in what he said that's new to you. And okay, setting aside all of that, again, there's something to be said about everything he just commented on. But again, my bigger concern is not so much whether or not what he says there is true and right, but how will it be perceived? What are the optics in light of the pride liturgies that we're seeing when Rome's not coming down on those? Pride masses, rainbow crosses brought into St. Peter's. There's no heavy hand against those. There's no motu proprio against those. There's no encyclical against those. There's not even a general audience against those. For crying out loud, you would think a Pope by now would have done a general audience. They've talked about everything else in the world. They can't talk about some massive issue right now in the church. For whatever need there is to talk about ecology, we got it. I think we got the point at this point. Let's take care of the environment. Can we now talk about some of these bigger issues taking place in the church? I don't know, just my thoughts, but evidently it's really hard for the papacy to talk about these things. But the point is, when you have all of that going on, what are the optics and how are people going to process this? And frankly, the people who heard that homily and heard these points, how many of them are catechized in ecclesiology well enough to actually buy into what the priest just said? How many of them, honestly? You talk to your average person in a Latin Mass community or a Novus Ordo, how well informed are they in matters of ecclesiology? Well, look, in my experience across the board, very few Catholics are familiar with this conversation from an ecclesiastical and magisterial perspective, or even church history perspective for that matter. Most people don't know the history of the Roman Rite, let alone the interventions of the magisterium on these points. So to kind of throw out all these points, however legitimate they may be, how many of the people who are hearing that really have the foundation to process it and receive it right now? Has there really been enough catechesis in these communities in Tennessee preparing people for something like this? I don't know. Maybe there has been. I don't know. Those of y'all who are in Tennessee, maybe you can say, yeah, sure. My priest has been catechizing us really well on this. Fair enough. But if they haven't, to kind of throw it out there all of a sudden, it's like putting a seed and planting a seed on hard ground, right? You got to loosen up the ground. You got to loosen up the soil. You don't do that, it's not going to take root and grow. You have to catechize people and prepare them for something like this. So those are my thoughts specifically on this particular point. I did notice that, some people are pointing to Cardinal Sarah, who says, I've spoken to the Pope about the traditional Latin Mass. He's aware, he's father of all. I don't know what that means. And then it seems like a lot of people reading the comment section, they don't know what that means. Okay, you've spoken to him. He's the father of all. Okay, but what does that mean? I mean, does that mean he's going to dial back Traditionis Custodes? He's going to open up access to the Latin Mass more? It didn't appear that that's the case. So it appears that Pope Leo is aware of the concerns and is still moving forward full steam ahead. And, people in the comment section are kind of picking up on that. I found it ironic. One commenter said about Cardinal Sarah, very dismaying. Cardinal Sarah is a Pope-splainer, they say. I had to laugh out loud at that one. So a whole lot I could say about that. But, people are evidently not really buying what Cardinal Sarah is saying here, because they're seeing with their own two eyes, something very, very different, right? So It will be interesting to see, maybe moving forward, if Pope Leo is going to maybe take into account some of the feedback that he's been given, or is he just going to say no, full steam ahead? Let's keep going and let's continue to implement Traditionis Custodes. There are a few other things I want to briefly talk about here, but I do see a super chat. Let me grab it. By the way, those of y'all just now tuning in, hit that subscribe button. I really would appreciate your support, especially if you find that the content here is balanced, honest, candid. Maybe if you feel that you don't find that kind of candid and honest and balanced conversation elsewhere, hey, show me some support by hitting that subscribe button and the like button. But I see there's a super chat. Let me grab it. Dr. Allen, thank you so much for the super chat. Says, this is not a reason for division. I often attended the Cathedral of Sacred Heart of Jesus with my family in Knoxville. Very reverent Novus Ordo. Can't reach East Tennessee culture with the TLM. That's the wisdom of Vatican II. Look, I totally get that. I understand what you're saying, and there's that conversation that can be had. 100%, I understand what you're saying. Look, you're likely going to make a lot of the points that I've made before in this conversation, right? So I don't disagree with you at all. But I guess what I'm saying is that, you can be right, but people may not be ready to receive it. I guess that's one of the things I've learned in the last year or two with my own commentary on this channel. I've often said things against the grain, and I've been right. And I've been vindicated numerous times at this point by Rome. But a lot of people weren't prepared to hear some of that and didn't have maybe enough foundation to hear some of it, and it wasn't received very well. And maybe there was a way where I could have prepared people with more catechesis and more information before having some of those conversations. Fair enough. I could do better. And maybe there's some cases like that where I was right, but maybe I need to be sensitive to how people are going to perceive this and maybe address that and prepare a better foundation before we can have that conversation. And I think the same can be said here. Look, Rome can be right on this particular point with Traditionis Custodes. As the day is long, that doesn't mean it's going to be received very well right now. And if there's a possibility for it to be received more effectively in the future, should it be implemented now? Or should more groundwork be laid to properly prepare people better for that with more catechesis? And maybe even more importantly, should the bigger liturgical issues in the church be addressed first? Because frankly, I think if the bigger issues like pride masses and stuff like that are addressed first, people would have less of a desire to flee from the Novus Ordo to a Latin Mass. That's the reality. If they had a properly well-celebrated Novus Ordo available to them, and they're not having to deal with pride masses and stuff like that, they're not going to likely feel like I need to get away from this and I have to flee to an Eastern Catholic liturgy or flee to a Latin Mass, or you won't have that as much. Maybe you'll still have it, but maybe not as much. So I think that underlying issue really needs to be addressed first, and then also prepare people to understand, here's why the Council Fathers wanted a liturgical reform. Here's why they wanted a restoration of some liturgical practices that had been lost over the years. And here's why some of the reforms Vatican II called for were not implemented by Paul VI in his concilium, and then the implementation of the Missal of 1969 or 1970. Because you will note there are some points of disconnect between the Novus Ordo and what the Council Fathers called for. Why? Explain that to people. If they have answers and they have more catechesis and they understand the reason for the reform, people might be a little bit more willing to accept it. Plus, if they're perceiving the Novus Ordo as some kind of liturgical innovation and as something new, and they're perceiving the Latin Mass as something ancient in the Mass of the ages, they're going to obviously be more attracted to something that's more ancient and traditional. Maybe if there was some catechesis in explaining, actually, this element in the Latin Mass is an innovation and it's not ancient. This element over here in the Novus Ordo is a restoration of the ancient practice, and it's not antiquarianism. And then explain what antiquarianism is, why it's bad, and why this isn't that. That requires a great deal of catechesis. And admittedly, I guess it's just easier for Rome to lay down a heavy hand instead of taking the time to catechize people. But I don't know, just the thought here, instead of long-winded apostolic exhortations and encyclicals that almost nobody is going to read, how about more frequent but briefer points of catechesis on these important issues? Maybe how about a short encyclical every month instead of these long-winded ones that nobody reads except 2 people in the world, right? Well, maybe something that's 2,000 words and it's released every month, and it's not harping on ecology, but rather focuses on, I don't know, massive controversies in the church and explanations for how to maybe get some perspective on them and how to address them properly. My personal opinion. I'm not the Pope. I don't get to determine those things. But it's the way I perceive the situation. It seems like so much of this stuff from Rome is so out of touch with the needs of the faithful and so out of touch with reality. And it also is very much out of touch with how to communicate in a media age like today. My opinion, though. I do want to make y'all aware, I did confirm that, yes, Pope Leo did order an act of reparation for the altar at St. Peter's Basilica, where the man horrifically urinated on the altar just a few days ago. He did order a penitential rite to rededicate the altar after that sacrilege, and it was carried out. And so, I heard some rumblings that he may have ordered it, but I wasn't able to find anything official to confirm it up until a few of y'all. Thank y'all so much. Y'all sent me this and a few others confirming it. So I wanted to make sure to touch base with y'all and let y'all know that it was rededicated and restored for liturgical use after that act of profanation. Now, you know what? You might not be aware of something I just did for patrons who participate at the second tier and above, the $10 a month tier and above, whether you join right here on YouTube or on Patreon. But what I just did is I enhanced some of the perks and benefits for y'all. And I also am going to start offering weekly posts for those of y'all who participate at the tier 2 and above level. So the $10 in a month level. And I just offered my first post, and it was on the question of the Catholic Church in France, among other places, burning the Talmud, and why the Pope and the bishops chose to burn the Talmud in 1242. And I go over a little bit of the disputations that took place at the time, the debates between Catholic theologians and rabbis in Paris. I went over the 1240 disputation in Paris. And I talked about that in contrast with Dignitatis Humanae and the Second Vatican Council's emphasis on respecting everyone's right to practice their religion privately and publicly, which would exclude any burning of Talmuds, right? So you have a huge change there, right? And so I talk about that in detail. And the reason why I mentioned that to you is not only to alert you patrons to that new feature, which, by the way, there's others. For higher levels, we're going to start having that monthly meeting again. We're going to be meeting on Zoom to talk about theology for patrons who participate at the $25 a month level and higher. And you also have an opportunity for Q&A. We're going to have that. And for those who are participating at the higher level above that, you'll have an opportunity for one-on-one meetings with me if you want to meet with me via Zoom and ask me whatever questions you have. So yeah, like I said, the perks have been enhanced, but the reason why I'm alerting you to it is I just came across this as soon as right before I went live. Cardinal Dolan, maybe I need to do a whole show on this, taking part in a synagogue service in New York City for Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. which I probably need to do a whole video on just the Day of Atonement, explaining what it was and what took place liturgically, prior to Jesus. What exactly took place for the Day of Atonement? And I think you would find some of it really, really, really fascinating. But be that as it may, so there's a Yom Kippur service in the New York City synagogue, and Cardinal Dolan from New York participates in this. And of course, he's mentioning the Levitical priestly blessing that's found in Numbers, right? And that's interesting because the first documented case of anything biblical, it's like the earliest attestation to anything in the Bible. Do you know what it was? The Ketef Hinnom silver scrolls, roughly 600, 700 BC. And it's the priestly blessing in Numbers. That's the first thing to ever be discovered. That's the earliest in the archaeological record. So that's the blessing that he issues here in conjunction with the rabbi. But watch this. And if you read my post, those of you patrons, or if you join at that level, the tier 2 level and above, the $10 a month level, whether here or on Patreon, you'll find this video fascinating in light of what I just wrote to you guys, right? So take a look at this where Cardinal Dolan does this, right? Somebody said there's no sound. Okay, let me try it one more time. I apologize. Thank you for alerting me there in the chat, by the way. Let's try it one more time here. Okay. Well, I don't hear it now. Hold on. Well, what happened to the sound? It somehow muted, but okay. Let's try it again.
Here, we don't have all Jews here, but on the occasion of the 60th, on the occasion of Nostra Aetate and our friendship, a Jewish Catholic responsive blessing. Yevarechecha Adonai v'yishmerecha.
May the Lord bless you and keep you.
Ya'er Adonai panav elecha v'chuneka.
May his face shine upon you and be gracious to you.
Yisa Adonai panav elecha ve'asem lecha shalom.
May he look upon you with kindness and give you his peace.
And to that we can all say,
Amen. Amen. Way to go. Love you. Thanks for the...
So we don't have...
All right, look, maybe I'll do a whole video on that, right? But for whatever we can say about that, back to the point of this video, the implementation of restrictions from Traditionis Custodes on the Latin Mass. How will that be perceived in this context? Okay, so people, think about it, okay? If you're one of those people who you don't understand the needs for the liturgical reform, you don't understand why Traditionis Custodes happen, you don't maybe have that catechetical foundation, so your whole world is uprooted right now. You're really confused. Your Latin Mass has just been shut down. Your whole world is confused because you just drove, you just moved to that location so you can be part of the Latin Mass, and now it's shut down. That's happening to you, and then you open up YouTube and you see this, right? Or you see, Muslims granted a prayer room at the Vatican, Apostolic Library. You see that, or you see Rome allowing for an official procession of a rainbow cross into St. Peter's Basilica. Or the Pope sends a bishop to celebrate the LGBTQ Mass. You can understand why a person is not going to process this well, because they're going to be like, wait, everyone else is tolerated except me. Every other liturgical expression, even if it's not even Christian, is tolerated except me. You know, there's even concelebrations with women priests from Anglicanism and Lutheranism that's tolerated except the Latin Mass. You can understand why a person would be hurt and confused by that. And so you have to ask, in this day and age, in this context, how are these restrictions being perceived? How is this helpful? Those are things to consider, and maybe even things to sympathize with. Anyways, those are my thoughts I wanted to offer. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button if you appreciate the content. Hey, become a patron on Patreon, patreon.com/Reason to Theology. Go and check out those perks. And also, again, consider rtcourses.com, where I'm offering my courses on the magisterium, what it is, its history, how to understand it, how to read magisterial documents. If you purchase my lecture that's coming up next Saturday, Understanding Papal Infallibility, Its Nature, History, and Challenges. If you purchase that lecture, which once you purchase it, you'll always have access to it, $24.99. When you purchase it, you'll at that point get another 30% off the already discounted price on the magisterium courses that I'm offering, teaching you comprehensively what it is and how to understand it. So go and take advantage of that discount while it still lasts and is still available. That's going to do it for now. We'll see you later. God bless.